Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report. Today we're playing the Pan-Oceanian military orders against the villainous combined army, and the scenario is Uplink Center. Now, the list that we'll be playing today is the list that we featured very recently on the Pan-Oceanian military orders faction focus video. The list in that video received quite a lot of feedback from established military orders players, and feedback is of course always welcome and valuable. It showcases how there are a bunch of different ways to play this game and different perspectives. And if you don't expose yourself to those different perspectives, you will never see the other ways that people approach and play the game, and you won't be able to avail yourself of their experience. And so to all the people who commented on the video, thank you. I may agree with some of your takes, I may disagree with some of your takes, but if I don't get to read them, I'll never know what they are, and I'll never see how broad this game can be. Now, from my perspective, this list was written with a fairly simple goal in mind, but one which is not necessarily easy to achieve. What I wanted this list to be was something that I could put in the hands of someone who was new to military orders or potentially new to the game, but was attracted to military orders because of the fantasy that they promised, which was, and I used this line a few times in the faction focus video, knights with swords and guns, which is just cool as hell. Now, the challenge is that actually making that work in military orders can be difficult. There are a lot of heavy infantry in the faction, and it can be hard to know which ones to choose, and if you just reach for the most expensive and premium ones, the faction does not have a low end that supports that. The infrastructure just isn't there to provide the cheap orders and fill a list out if you take multiple really deluxe pieces, and you can find yourself with a list that at worst doesn't work, or at best does but has some limitations and is maybe giving up on some of the strength both of the faction and of Pan-Oceania in general. My thesis for this list was that I wanted a couple of things. The first is that I wanted a Pan-Oceanian quality heavy weapon that could really do some suppression duties in active turn, and so if we look at Combat Group 2, that's where we'll see that. We've got a Tikbalang of Montesa. Now the military orders Tikbalang is a little bit worse than some of the other ones that are available. In other factions that have got access to a Tikbalang, they have the wonderful Lieutenant +1 order profile. We don't here. We'll live with that. It's still an excellent tag. Ballistic Skill 15, Mimetism, Climbing Plus, Heavy Machine Gun, what's not to love? Supporting the Tikbalang, we've got a Tekbi, a Sasha, and two Mulebots. The Tekbi is there, of course, to provide a tag com, but frankly, you'll see a Tekbi even in lists that don't include tags in military orders because cheap regulars are just thin on the ground. The Sasha is there to be a model that can be an order outlet if the Tikbalang isn't. In the original list, I had the Pathfinder in Combat Group 2. I wanted to test the Sasha here just as a small variation. It was fine. And then the two Mulebots are present, firstly because, again, cheap regular orders are thin on the ground in military orders, but secondly, this list has a lot going on that it can make use of baggage with. Now, in the first combat group, we have the other things that I wanted present here, and at a simple level, it's a whole lot of knights. We have 7 knights of various military orders in this 10-person combat group, which means the list ticks the box of doing the thing that players who are coming to military orders for that fantasy of knights with swords and guns want to do. But the choices that I've made here are also configured with some pretty specific goals in mind, and you could, if you're playing this list yourself, absolutely adjust those goals. Now, as an offensive tip of the spear, we have a 3 or 4 person hospital link led by a Knight of Hospitaller FTO Lieutenant, and joined by Joan of Arc Chain of Command Non-Specialist, Kyle Hawkins, and then optionally, and it would be in this game, a Knight of Montesa FTO Paramedic. Now, there are a few interesting choices that are being made here, but the important one to note first is that I've very intentionally gone with the non-specialist chain of command Joan. There are 2 reasons for that. The first reason is that it's a chain of command profile, which means that to put this list in loss of lieutenant, the opponent needs to kill or isolate 2 robust heavy infantry rather than just 1. If you're giving a list to a new player and you just slap Joan of Arc in there as the LT, you're almost beholden to have chain of command in there some other way. That starts requiring expensive profiles that trim the number of knights in the list. And so while having Joan as the lieutenant with inspiring leadership would turn the 2 irregular models we have into regular models, the benefit I felt in this case was that I would add redundancy against the risk of loss of lieutenant, and secondarily, you can take more risks with Joan if she isn't your lieutenant. One of the ideas I put forward in the faction focus video, and which I very much stand by, is that Joan is just an absolutely hog wild combat profile. 45 points for her complete package is outstanding. And so shackling yourself to the limitations of making her the lieutenant, while there are absolutely very valuable upsides, and if you're an experienced player, you can manage those risks and still get full use out of her. If I'm giving this list to a new player, I want them to be able to put Joan off the chain and go nuts with her, and that means needing to be able to take risks. I had some people say this was a terrible idea. I had some people reach out and say they absolutely agreed. Again, showcase to how many different and interesting perspectives there are that can be had about this game. Now, otherwise in the link, the Hospitaller FTO lets you form the link in the first place. Linking Joan is quite good, and it adds useful things to the list otherwise. It's a decent quality multi-rifle that can take some fights at different range bands, and it's a tin bot. Tin bots are very useful. We've got both of our heavy infantry links packing tin bots in this list, just as some insurance against hacking and other info war. Then we've got Hawkins. If you want to hear me rant about how good Hawkins is, please check out any of the last couple of faction focus videos or Panoceania, where I talk about how he's really cool and he would indeed do great work this game. Now, the Montesa FTO can join either of the two fire teams. In this list, it will join the Hospital Fire Team, but it forms kind of part of a broad thematic package with it and then 3 Teutonic Knights. Slightly different Teutonic Knight profiles, but the important thing is that they are all Teutons, they can all link, and they all have Panzerfausts. And what that does for the list is give us our defensive toolbox. And this is drawing on a wisdom that goes back to the days of like Toha in N3 and N4. Wounds are a valuable defensive resource, not just because they stall your opponent out and mean that your defensive pieces take longer to kill, but they mean that your opponent has to engage more face-to-face rolls, and every face-to-face roll your opponent takes in their active turn is a chance for you to get lucky. And if your reactive models have the right weapons, you getting lucky in your reactive turn can present a catastrophic inflection point for your opponent. And that's what the Montesa Knight and the 3 Teutons do in this list. You have a Blitzen and 3 Panzerfausts, and all of them are linked, and all of them have multiple wounds. Now, yes, limited cover on all of them, but they do still get the cover bonus to armor, and they are still heavy infantry. And what that means is that this list can kind of reliably expect, absolute worst case scenario, to still be able to put out 14 to 16 dice worth of AROs before everything is expended and your models are suppressed. Ideally, they'll pass religious checks and go prone once they're out of Panzerfaust. But if you're rolling that many dice over the course of an ARO turn, just to reload later on, your odds of scoring a crit at some point or just winning a face-to-face roll across all of those engagements is high. Like, cumulatively, the probability of you getting lucky in ARO when you have an ARO setup like this is high. And when you get lucky in ARO with a Panzerfaust or a Blitzen, that is a blowout for your opponent. And that is a kind of defensive setup that a new player can grapple with, right? That's the kind of thing that a new player can go, okay, cool, these guys have got Panzerfaust and they're tough, I can put them up on ARO, and they will probably be okay or useful or at least take long enough to kill that I get some value. Even in an absolute worst case, all of those models benefit from 3-person Haris bonuses, or core and Haris bonuses, which means they also get the dodge and discover bonuses, which means those Teutonic Knights are the best things at dodging in the entire game, if that's what it takes. The Teutonic Knight team can also move out inactive if it needs to. It's not going to this game, but if it absolutely needs to, it's got a specialist and they're linked and they can move forward and they can take some fights. Finally, Pathfinder with Tactical Awareness, just a utility piece. It can go and press buttons, it can do Pathfinder-y things, sensors are very useful, it can clear out repeaters, etc., and then a Warcore and then a Fugazi. Overall, this was a list that I was very excited to play, and I'm happy to report that it would not let me down. Now, playing against me today would be a combined army list piloted by my friend Owen, and per audience request, what I've done here is I've cut out all of the non-obvious hidden information. While we're going through this, I invite you to have a guess about what it is I might be facing down in terms of the hidden elements. And yeah, there's some hidden stuff in this list. This is only 2.5 SWC and 216 points worth of things that are obvious, even when we account for the Libertos being fairly obvious. So we have a Carontid Lieutenant. It's the APHMG with Multispectral Visor level 3, a Libertos, 2 Emitrons, an R-Drone, an Icadron, 2 Datarazi, and a Krakot. The list could feasibly have had 3 Datarazi, but a Krakot can be very high value, and once you have 2 Datarazi, you're often kind of mostly set for smoke, so the Krakot is just a little optional flex. In Combat Group 2, we've got Bit and Kiss, a Medtech Obsidon with Cyberplug, and a Ranta. Gosh, I wonder if he's also going to have a Puzzler. Could we ever expect such a thing, and then 2 Gakis. Now, this is light. This is not a lot of stuff on the board. I mean, like, okay, it's actually a lot of stuff. It's a Carontid and the Dadarazi, and some hacking, and a doctor and an engineer, and we can be pretty sure a puzzler's coming, but that still leaves 2 free troop slots and a lot of options as to what could fill those. Now, this being Owen, my guess was that there might be Kodali in the works somewhere because she is absolutely his favorite pet profile, but there are other options that can be present as well, which we'll see as the game progresses. So, here's our table, and as noted, we are playing Uplink Center. Uplink Center means 3 objectives across the center of the board. This is very much just old school acquisition, but with no point for classifieds. And so that means your goal is to have activated the 2 consoles on either side of the central objective, and then control the central antenna. Pretty much all of these objectives, you can work towards getting the points for having activated the antennas at any point over the course of the game, but after that it's a big rush towards the center because you're attempting to control these at game end. Now, acquisition was a scenario that I always kind of liked in N3 and N4 because I felt it balanced quite nicely the tension between first and second player. The scoring is all very second player favored, but this is a 16-inch deployment zone scenario, which can give the first player a real springboard. I still like it very much in N5, and in N5 it's kind of even more interesting. One of the things that I have observed in N5 is that there is a tendency, just in terms of force composition, a lot of armies are a bit more resilient or robust or have a greater depth of capability. They tend to last longer, and so games tend to last longer. And acquisition, or uplink center, works really nicely in that situation where the game is not resolved moving into round 3. You really want those everything still to play for moments, and while there can absolutely be an attritional advantage, and Uplink Center is a bit more susceptible to entering a solve state towards the end of the game, it still functions nicely in N5 because of how the game has changed generally. Now, I win the lieutenant role against a willpower 16 lieutenant, and I actually elect to deploy second on the left side of the table. That is for a couple of reasons. The first is that I want to test my defenses against what I expect is coming. I want to see if all of these things I've put into the list that I think are robust defensively actually can be. And secondly, Combined Army do not regularly have access to counterintelligence, and actually can be quite vulnerable to having their orders stripped on the first turn if you are able to do things like pin back their impetuous models, which I felt I would be able to do. So while I didn't exactly feel 100% safe going second against Combined Army, it was absolutely a threat. The general robustness of this list, like what are they going to walk a Speculo killer in against in this list, for example, everything has martial arts that I'm worried about having guild. It did feel like I had a good shot defensively. Owen, of course, elects to go first, and so he deploys as follows. There is a smattering of Ematrons and Ardrones and Ichadrons all along the back edge of the table. Dr. Worm himself is nooked back here in a very nice, safe position. There's an Imatron that's failed to make its landing roll. There's an R-drone over here. The Ichadron is hanging out somewhere down here, for example, where it can just extend its baggage over Bit and Kiss. And then Bit and Kiss are on this rooftop with their deployable repeater. That deployable repeater will be visible, but I think Owen is fine with me shooting it if I need to. That's an order out of my turn and no skin off his nose. His Ranter would be forward deployed up here, and then the Carontid would be his reserve deployment, and it would deploy, you can't quite see it, but it would deploy behind this building. The Libertos would deploy around here. This is its mine, watching out over the central area. And then the Dadarazi and Krakots are deployed here, and here, and here. The Krakot has rolled up +3 Fizz, which is very good for making grenade spec fire, although my list is not a list that is particularly good at making spec fires against. Now, there's one notable misdeployment, I think, with this list, which will become more apparent when we see what the hidden information is, and that's Bit and Kiss on this rooftop. This is a mistake that I have also made many times running them in N5. They're both hanging out there prone, they feel safe, but actually I think you need to use them aggressively these days. With the range bands of pitchers, and particularly when they're in a small combat group with only limited orders, you have to have a very clear plan for how they're going to establish a repeater network. And if that plan involves having to stand up on a rooftop, they could very potentially be pinned down. And in this case, they simply won't have the orders to get off of the rooftop and forward and shoot repeaters, so they're pretty limited to just firing from that rooftop, which I can respond to by pinning them down with guns. I think you actually have to be quite aggressive with them in N5 and in a scenario like acquisition and uplink center where you've got a larger deployment zone. I think these buildings here were just shy of 16 inches, but deploying them kind of in a space like this or even over here might have been a better plan. Now, for my part, obviously when I'm doing all of my deployment, I know I have not seen the Carotid MSV heavy machine gun at that point, but I do know that a Willpower 16 Lieutenant is coming somewhere. But I'm relatively confident in being able to stall it out at least somewhat with the Knights, and so what I want to do instead is really limit the potential of Owen to take an aggressive first turn using impetuous activations. Impetuous activations aren't real orders, they shouldn't be treated as such. But if you position just so, they can give you a springboard, and one of the things that this combined army list wants to do is make use of that to launch attacks on the first turn, if there isn't another bigger haymaker that it's throwing. And so really useful is to pin back the Dadarazi, and especially the Krakot, so that they can't make easy attack runs. And so to do that, we've set up pretty much a hard castle worth of AROs. So to call out in particular the Teutonic Knights, we have one here, and one here, and then the Montesa Knight here. All of them are standing, all of them have very significant AROs. Very important to note, the Montesa Knight is not nearly as good an ARO against Morat warbands as other pieces might be, because a Blitzen is kind of useless against them, and so part of why it's deployed over here is to potentially stall out larger and heavier things that might attack the hospital order fire team that's deployed kind of in and around this corner. So the Teutons with Panzerfaust AROs, though, are very good at pinning back monkeys, and we've got some very long lines of ARO along the rooftops down into this alleyway. We can actually sort of see through here if this Dadarazi was to stand up, and then both of these Teutons here can very aggressively pin in this Krakot if it tries to move out and around. All of this space here is just very exposed to Panzerfaust fire, and so if that Krakot moves, it's just getting its head blown off. Now, as noted, the hospital fire team is deployed kind of aggressively in this corner, or defensively in this corner. We've got the hospital lieutenant himself hanging out back here. He's actually standing. I'm having him standing because I want him as an ARO piece. Not as an ARO piece against like anything that's moving aggressively across the board, but against the potential of models like Kodali landing into the backfield, or even just things like Garkis. There's like one, actually no, there's a Garki here. That isn't a Dadarazi. The other Dadarazi I think is hanging down around here somewhere. Either way, the little goblin is pinned back. I want this as an ARO piece against anything that might be making close assaults into my deployment or landing via combat jump. Joan is prone behind this car, Kyle is prone behind this car, and then once I've seen where his Carontid goes down, cool, I can ARO with the Tikbalang as well. It deploys over here. This deployment on the Tikbalang is positioned so that it can very much jump back. It can fail a guts roll. It can attempt to fail a guts roll. Actually, no, never mind. Tikbalangs of Montesa aren't religious troops. They're just regular Tikbalangs with CC attack -3. It can fail a guts roll if it needs to and duck back behind this taller terrain piece, but otherwise it's another element that is AROing, and it's particularly watching down in this space here and bit and kiss if they should stand. This is a long walk for the Carontid to get up and around to, and so I'd be fine with him relocating to take that shot, which is not actually what's going to happen in the first turn. So, Owen is going first. I strip 2 orders from the big combat group, and after a bit of eyeballing back and forth, he determines, yeah, there's not really any way to impetuous any of the models other than the Garkis, and so the 2 Garkis begin their run up and around in this direction, but there's really not much they'll be able to do against the pieces over here. What this list really wants them to do is do things like run through the midfield and trigger mines, kill deployable repeaters that have been placed by infiltrators, etc. They'd be quite good if I had Trinitarians, but there's really not much of value that they can do against a field full of knights. So with the Dadarazi somewhat pinned back and the Krakot unable to attack, Owen now has to figure out what he's going to do in terms of pushing forward. There is a line where he could move the Carontid MSV up and take some face-to-face rolls. The Carontid is not bad into limited cover Teutons, but it's also not necessarily efficient, and the risk of failure can be very significant, particularly if it has to fight the Montesa FTO. So he takes a different line. And one of the things his list can do, which it's very good at, but in a sense my list is resilient to, his list, and especially we'll see this when the first hidden thing reveals, is very good at figuring out what the opponent is most weak to and then using a specific attack piece. Does your opponent have ARO pieces that can be easily suppressed by the Corrupted? Go nuts, do that. Has your opponent completely null deployed, perhaps relying on hacking as a defense? Well, Datarazi and especially the Krakot are fantastic at putting damage into that. Does your opponent have info war that they're relying on very heavily, which might be susceptible to info war counterattack? Well, we'll see how it might deal with that. Or generally, is your list quite hackable? Okay, we choose that line of play. But in this particular case, my list is just chunky. It is just not easy to perish, and so finding a specific line that works against it doesn't really have enormous vulnerabilities exactly. So he goes with the I think hacking is the line of play here, because there is very specifically one model in my list that is hackable and not protected by a tin bot and which can be a high value target to hack. And he starts by just see if this will work. Bit and Kiss spend an order in combat group 2. They can't stand without being shot, so he just stands Kiss, walks Kiss forward, and fires a pitcher downtown. It's a long shot. It's worth it if it succeeds, it doesn't, and Kiss gets blown away by a Panzerfaust. That's fine, it was worth spending the one order to do so. To note, if Bit and Kiss had been deployed a little bit differently, there might have been a safer way for them to approach that. But I do have a very strong ARO presence, worth a shot. Let's move on to the primary combat group, at which point something spends an order from hidden deployment. Now, I had an inkling what this would be when Kiss tried to land a repeater next to my Tikbalang, and that inkling was confirmed when a Silhouette 6 camouflage marker revealed back here and began to move around and moved 6-2. At which point, yep, alarm klaxons begin to sound. Warning, warning. This is not a Kodali Noctifer list, that's a fucking Anathematic. And oh lord, he coming. Now, the good news for me here is that my defensive position is still pretty good, and as a reminder, all of these models I have on high ARO are part of 3-person fire teams. They get a discover bonus, and there are overlapping fields of fire in many cases. And that's going to be one of the things that saves me this turn, because this Anathematic wants to push forward and engage, but a lot of the movements that he has to make are situations where I'm able to have 2 models see him as he's moving, and do things like have a Teuton declare discover, while the Montesa Knight declares hold. And while we are outside of good plasma range, the Anathematic is just not really willing to take the risk of that Blitzen connecting and potentially stalling out the entire engagement. And these things in combination with the fact that I am able to pass some discover rolls thanks to that +3 mean that there are multiple situations over the course of the advance where the Anathematic actually ends up having to pause and take an order off to recamo, but it does eventually push forward. And at this point, Owen has to make a decision between trying to find a position where he's in cover and start taking engagements with plasma, or push forward even more aggressively and go for a potential haymaker. Now, I would have been able to tolerate either of those engagements. I am fortunately positioned in a way where plasma is not going to do the critical thing where it can blow out multiple units in one attack. Because I was kind of setting up assuming that there was a risk of Noctifer, nothing is in range, particularly if we look at this rooftop over here, right? Nothing is in range where a single impact template will splash onto multiple pieces. There is always terrain or some other element in the way that would prevent that from happening, which means the Anathematic is going to only be able to engage one thing at a time. And this distance here between these 2 points as well is pretty sketchy in terms of a 16-point engagement range. That would leave the Anathematic really just able to engage the Montesa Knight, which he will probably kill. It will take a little while. The Montesa has Mimetism, but that would probably be all the Anathematic gets with his plasma kills. And so what he likes to do instead is, after a point where a failed discover roll happens against one of the camouflage marker states, he actually attempts to go all in and is able to break the cordon and push through to here. He gets into a little nook inside a doorway and with a surprise attack reveals and total controls the Tikbalang. Now at this point he's only got a couple of orders left, and one of the things he contemplates is he's out of line of sight, recamouflaging. However, this is a Pathfinder drone bot up here, and so recamo at least for now is not an option. Instead, he spends the orders on the Tikbalang, turns it away from his army, faces back towards this table. He can't do the Cordyceps tactic where he climbs onto a wall and just leaves it there, because a Tikbalang has climbing plus and is immune to that, but he can blaze away with the heavy machine gun. Now, with only a couple of orders to spend, what I'm comfortable doing is just declaring lots of dodges. I have turned to face everything toward the Tikbalang when it got attacked, and after multiple orders engaging at close range, a possessed model is only ballistic skill 12, the Tikbalang is able to secure a kill. Very rudely, it's a kill on the Mulebot, which means all of my plans to reload will cease to work, but it just gets that one kill. leaving everything else in good nick. And that's a good first turn. Yes, I'm short on command tokens. Yes, I'm going to have to spend one of my few remaining command tokens to depossess the Tickbalang. Yes, I now have to solve the problem of there is an Anathematic in my deployment zone. But that is a solvable problem, and I'm otherwise only down one order. So we go into my first turn, and I have to contemplate and actually think a little bit about how I'm going to approach this. One of the amusing things to me actually is that it would be kind of easy to say, if I had a multispectral visor model, that would be the thing that I would use to attack the Anathematic, but actually any of the MSV2 models I would have access to would be terrible for this particular task because of how closely I would have to engage the Anathematic. A Crozier would be firing in bad range, a Blackfriar would be firing in bad range, but very happily I'm not relying on either of those pieces and instead have brute force to try and solve this issue. So I turn my mind to what are the options I have to engage here, and while it is very tempting to have the Teutonic Knights move in and engage at point blank, surround, and stab him to death, I decline to do that for two reasons. The first is that I kind of still need them where they are. There is still a second aspect over here that could be a significant threat, and I want them to pin him back. The second, more significant reason is that they don't have stealth. A lot of knights in military orders do, but it's not universal, and Teutons don't. And so instead, we're going to call on the most powerful team we have. It's going to be time for the Hospital Link to move out. Now, having had the Anathematic reveal, I am relatively confident that the only remaining thing I have to deal with in terms of hidden deployment is a puzzler, and I'm like 95% sure that it's here. That's not guaranteed, but it was deployed before I placed anything, and that is just the most ball-achingly annoying place a puzzler could be, so I just kind of assume that it's there. So the Hospital Knight team moves out. They move out, cover the ground, they hug along this wall here. Joan moves up as well, the Hospital Knight moves up as well. Along the way, we do take some engagements because there are Garkis that have moved forward into these positions here, and I have enough orders. And so I don't want to trigger Frenzy on Joan just yet. There's no need to. I use the Hospital Knight Lieutenant instead. He spools up his multi-rifle. It's got shock rounds. That will just deal with the Garkis. I mean, they've got Explode anyway, so it's much as I'm not walking into their Explode distance. And the Hospital Knight comfortably puts the Garkis down as we move and turn our attention to the Anathematic. And it's going to be Kyle who leads the charge. Now, the Anathematic in the position that it's in, I can get it out of cover, but only if I move all the way out and around to here. There's like pros and cons to doing this. If I'm in cover, I'm harder to hit. He does have a template weapon. But if I keep Kyle behind this car in terms of making the engagements, I will be in good range, but I'll never be in a position where I can walk into close combat. And so I make the call to actually really aggressively charge Kyle around this corner because, firstly, it will let me get within 6 inches, and secondly, I'm out of cover, but he's out of cover as well. That's a good enough face-to-face roll to take. And the face-to-face roll actually is sufficiently challenging. The Anathematic would like to do things like hack back, but ballistic skill attack -3 and the tin bot make that completely non-viable. The gunshot isn't even particularly fantastic either. I'm 4 dice 14s and he would be 1 dice 13s. Again, ballistic skill attack -3 is really good. And so he actually elects to pulsar me in the hopes of basically killing me as part of a trade. He has a bunch of wounds, remember. He can kind of afford to do that. I put some shotgun rounds into him. I connect with a bunch of damage. I do take the wound myself. And then we charge into close combat. So Kyle's taken 1 wound already. And at this point, the Anathematic has to decide between whether or not he templates again or CC attacks. And because it's interesting, basically, he goes with the CC attack. Anathematics have got a monofilament CC weapon -3, which is pretty damn scary, but Kyle is still a very good close combatant. And so the worst does not happen. He wins the engagement, and the Anathematic gets put all the way to dead. Big thumbs up. Now, if Kyle had failed, if he'd only done some damage, for example, I still had Joan there. Joan would very comfortably, I could reform the link if I needed to, mostly just to confirm that she's got the tin bot. She could have made the same attack, all very doable, but Kyle takes a wound but gets it done and puts the Anathematic down. That's an absolutely baller first turn. We're going to use most of the rest of the orders we have just repositioning, but that does leave us with some orders in Combat Group 2. The Tickbalang will reposition, but otherwise we need to figure out how we're going to spend those orders, and that's part of what the Sasha is there for. She's going to climb down and activate this console over here, and then climb up and around there. Just gets me some points on the board. It stores up effort for future turns. Yes, Owen could make a run on that objective himself, but I don't have anything for the Tickbalang to shoot, and that makes me some scenario progress, which Owen will at least need to spend orders himself to try and undo, and there are limits on how many specialists he has in this list. So, heading into Owen's second turn, alright, well, it's time for the Carontid to spool up its weapons. Owen still has to forego his impetuous activations, but with some coordinated and cautious movements, he's able to get the Datarazi up and around, able to get some smoke down here, and move the Carontid up and around, and it will start blazing away and engaging things. It will engage the Tikbalang first, which is a quite favourable face-to-face roll. It does indeed beat the Tikbalang, which is just going to, after a little bit of time, move back and hide. He's going to attempt to engage this Teutonic Knight up here, which again, after some back and forth, I actually attempted to dodge here. I'm not sure if that was correct. The option shooting back through smoke with a Teuton, in this case, would be 2 dice on 7s, and a Panzerfaust is a Panzerfaust. I've only got one left on that guy, but it probably would have been correct for me to fire the Panzerfaust before I did anything else, but I wanted to at least try, hey, how good is dodging on 18s? As it happens, not great when you roll a 19 and your opponent crits you a couple of times, and this Teuton goes all the way down to, not dead, but he goes all the way to unconscious in a single volley. Well, he was only 18 points, that's totally fine. Now, that's some good luck on the Carontid's part, but what's going to happen now is that to take further engagements, he's going to have to expose himself to a little bit of risk. He's going to have to take a doorway up here and come onto this rooftop, at which point he can be engaged by a Panzerfaust, not this one over here, but a Panzerfaust and a Blitzen at the same time. And it's in this position, with only a few orders left in the tank, that things begin to go the other way for him. We have some inconclusive engagements, and then on the second last or last order of the turn, he, from an initial firing position where he can see both, he ducks back down through the door, ends up on ground level over here, but takes an engagement with both again. And at this point, the worst occurs, and he loses both face-to-face rolls. Now, he's won everything up till now, and he's having to split burst to take this fight. This is not an unlikely occurrence, but he does indeed lose both face-to-face rolls. And as a result, in one engagement, he takes 2 wounds and is isolated by the Blitzen. And that is just a real bad time. And to kind of showcase how the game is going to go here, I'm actually going to jump forward to the last picture we have, which is going to be taken at the end of my second turn, because I am totally free to launch an attack with the Hospitaller Knights and just do a bunch of different things. The Hospital Knights are going to blitz forward in this direction. The Carontid's actually going to get access to some resets, and it does reset on force, but it does not succeed any, and this team is going to blow through here, clear out any interference, and deliver Joan to the deployment zone, at which point she's going to strafe through a bunch of the things down here, importantly, killing both of the Imatrons and putting this Datarazi into unconscious. I think she kills the other Datarazi as well. It's hanging out back down around here somewhere, and getting those kills is really significant, because what I'm doing here is something that is probably kind of rude. I am very specifically clearing out all of the Warhorse models that Owen has access to. What I want is for him to go into his final turn in loss of Lieutenant and with no Warhorses to make the gap. And indeed, that's basically what happens. With almost all of the Warhorses dead, he just doesn't have anything that he can meaningfully do with his third turn, which just puts him in very much a terrible position. That's going to produce a situation where on the final round, I'm easily able to get onto this objective here. Joan is going to actually frenzy backwards, and with her frenzy order, take a free gunfight that is going to put the Carontid down. Boom, frenzy. Absolutely not always a downside, and she is going to carry on the attack up and around here. Now the puzzler will reveal. Initially, it actually will reveal with a dodge to get into base contact with the objective. Joan will close in on it, and very hilariously, she will fail her dodge and then pass both of the EM rolls, eventually getting into close combat, put it down and occupy the central console, and then it's easy enough for the Tikbalang to come down and around here and activate this one as well. I don't think I get a specialist to actually activate this console, but that still puts me at 8 points after accounting for the 1 point for having an active lieutenant, and that's the 1 point that Owen gets as well. So a resounding win for the military orders, and definitely a very enjoyable game. One of the things was really noticeable, actually, just over the course of the game for me, was the sense that, like, I have more heavy infantry. Even if something goes wrong, I have so many more pieces that could theoretically be turned to defense or attack, and I didn't even need the Tikbalang to really spool up its heavy machine gun. In fact, the Tikbalang took overwhelmingly more attacks against my own forces than it did against the enemy. Compared to the combined army list, which had like very powerful pieces that need to be applied very precisely, my list could just be like, nah bro, I've got reserves. I've got 3 wounds worth of tag, 15 or 16 wounds worth of heavy infantry. Everything is scary up close, quite a few things are scary out to medium and long range. Loads of stuff has stealth, all the heavy infantry have tin bots, it's just robust. Now you could absolutely still change this list in a bunch of ways. You could make Joan the lieutenant, you could trim Joan for Gabriel de Fersen. In both those cases, you probably don't play with a hospital link and get military orders hacking into play instead. That's very serviceable. And if you wanted to free up points, you could even do things like exchange the Tikbalang of Montesa for a Sepulchre Knight, which is not a ton of points, but it frees up something like 13 or 15 points. which can create some pretty meaningful upgrades elsewhere. The only other thing to note is that even though Joan is not the lieutenant, and I'm not really playing this to play stupid games where I try and get my actual lieutenant killed in order to make her the LT. If I wanted to do that, I just make her the lieutenant. I'm pretty sure that, and we played it this way, I'm about 90% on this, I'd have to go back and check. Inspiring leadership has two separate effects. One of them is active if you're the LT, that's the irregular models become regular and the free coordinate. But there is a secondary effect that's kind of easy to forget, which is that when an inspiring leadership model is part of a command token, its coherency is increased to 10 inches. And my read of the rule is that that applies even if she isn't the lieutenant, and so we played it that way during this game, and that was actually enormously liberating. Like I didn't expect that to be a big deal. We have a local, or used to be a local, not anymore, lives in Darwin now, long-term, permanent, completely blue-pilled Planetianian player who was singing me the praises of inspiring leadership max in a fire team. And I'm like, does that actually do anything? Yeah, no, turns out it absolutely does. 10-inch coherency allows for some serious flexibility, which is really cool. So that was super neat as well. Overall, the list did all of the things that I wanted it to. I was really happy with it. I felt comfortable with how it played. And again, bearing in mind that the purpose of this list was specifically to give an easy on-ramp to a new player who has looked at military orders and gone, wow, cool, knights with guns and swords, I do think it met that objective. So if you are a new player or you're interested in getting into military orders and you're thinking about them in terms of like Invincible Army but in Panoceania, bear in mind that there is a lot more to the faction than this. There is some very good quality hacking. There is some very good quality midfield pieces. There are some exceptional quality jump troops. But if you want to start with the fantasy of a whole bunch of knights, this is a very serviceable list to do it. And I think this game kind of showcases some of that strength. So I hope very much that everyone's enjoyed this. Quick reminder, call to action, blah, blah, blah. If you've liked this, please click like, please hit subscribe. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by becoming a channel member. We have 3 levels of channel membership. I take requests from channel members and supporters generally for things like faction-focused topics and battle reports. Got something you want to see? Do let me know. You can also do one-off donations and leave messages via the Buy Me a Coffee page in the video description below, and there is an affiliate link as well. If you're looking to buy something from the Corvus Belli web store and want to chuck me $1 or 2, you can buy it using that code. If not, no sweat, just watching the video, leaving a comment, all that means a ton. I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.